Before we begin, tell me, where are you watching from? Have you ever felt something like this? Stay with me until the end and share your thoughts. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. The lights of the Plaza Hotel ballroom, a beacon of New York's white-collar wealth, felt cold, mirroring the chill of the diamond on Eleanor's ring finger. She was a vision in silk, yet felt utterly ethereal, a ghost in a designer gown. Her hand, trembling ever so slightly, clutched a heavy ivory envelope, a sealed testament to a decade of betrayal. Beside her, Arthur, her husband, a self-proclaimed titan of finance, raised a crystal glass, his face flushed with the arrogance of the self-made man he desperately pretended to be. The celebratory buzz and the clinking of glasses drowned out the quiet dread in the room, blinding him to the storm brewing at his side. He kissed her forehead, a proprietary, not affectionate gesture, and she offered a frozen smile. The narrator's voice cut through the clamor. With a dry, knowing edge, she only had $32 to her name, but what happened next changed everything. For Eleanor, the scent of expensive perfume and aged champagne was now the acrid smell of social shame and injustice. As Arthur took the stage, touting the launch of his new empire, the Sterling Group, she retreated into the shadows, a silent, costly trophy wife. Her quiet pain was a constant, dull throb, the humiliation of being treated as an incompetent appendage by a man whose every success she secretly funded. The antique pearl necklace she wore, a gift from her grandmother, felt less like jewelry and more like a shackle. Arthur often dismissed it as cheap costume jewelry, another subtle, stinging jab at her perceived lack of taste and irony that now tasted like cold steel on her tongue. In that precise moment, her fingers brushed a subtle vibration of her phone tucked inside her clutch. It was an email from an encrypted, anonymous source, a grainy photo, a brief CCTV clip, and a document detailing a hefty bank transfer. It was the smoking gun. Arthur's betrayal was not only a domestic affair with his sleek business partner Vanessa, but a clear-cut case of financial fraud, funds diverted to cover her luxurious pied-à-terre. The sting of the marital betrayal was secondary to the white-hot rage of having her capital stolen and her integrity compromised. The spotlight swung towards her, calling her up to the dais. It was time for the obligatory dedicated wife speech, the final flourish on Arthur's tapestry of lies. With a smile that was all ice and no warmth, Eleanor took the first deliberate step. She was no longer the woman with $32 to her name. That anonymous email and the envelope were now her ordnance, a meticulously loaded smoking gun aimed squarely at Arthur's colossal fraud. She was done with shame. Tonight, she was the architect of justice. Eleanor ascended the steps, and the silence in the grand ballroom was not one of anticipation, but a moment of palpable, stifled boredom. The city's elite, the same high rollers who would invest millions on Arthur's say-so, saw her as the predictable, decorative figurehead. She felt Arthur's gaze, a patronizing scrutiny, checking to see if his accessory was performing its function. She held the frigid microphone, a surprisingly solid anchor in her hand. Her smile was now a barely contained snarl. Then, she locked eyes with Vanessa in the front row, the mistress's gaze a tight, nervous nod of false triumph. That look, that flicker of hubris from the woman who believed the entire racket was secure, became the crucible for Eleanor's resolve. The real meeting was not with the people, but with the proof she had just ingested. The close-up of the CCTV footage, the specific account numbers on the transfer document, the irrefutable evidence that Arthur's double cross extended from their marriage bed right into their financials. The silent exchange with Vanessa, a battle of wills spanning across the velvet ropes, was the final fracture that shattered Eleanor's decade of compliance. She began speaking, her voice low, a near confessional whisper that forced the investors to lean in, desperate not to miss a word. "Tonight, we are here to toast a certain genius," she announced, the word dripping with an almost imperceptible, poisonous sarcasm that only Arthur's colossal ego prevented him from noticing. The kind of genius that manages to turn, well, nothing into everything. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. Arthur beamed, oblivious, nodding vigorously at his wife's perceived loyalty. The pearls at her throat seemed to catch the stage light, a tiny, defiant beacon of truth. Arthur has always been a masterful storyteller, she continued, her voice gaining a subtle crescendo. Her eyes drifted back to Vanessa, the silent communication a laser beam. I know everything. Vanessa, for all her veneer of corporate polish, visibly flinched, a slight tremor in her hand as she raised her glass. Eleanor had successfully seeded doubt and tension. The mystery was not if she was going to expose him, but how deeply she was prepared to cut. She placed a heavy, ivory envelope on the lacquered wood of the lectern, a deliberate, ceremonial gesture. The official seal of a venerable Boston law firm made the paper look like an edict. Arthur taught me a great deal about value, she said, her tone deceptively nostalgic. He taught me that true value isn't in what people can see, but in what they so desperately try to conceal. The density of the statement caused a ripple of murmurs. Arthur finally felt the sting of anxiety, his smile faltering, but he quickly suppressed it, convinced his wife was merely having a melancholy moment. But what is an empire? She addressed a high-profile crowd, her gaze sweeping over the potential investors. Without a foundation that is truly sound. She didn't expect an answer. She was laying the groundwork. The antique pearls, the symbolic object he had scoffed at for years, seemed to pulse with an almost spectral light. The thought of the subservient wife was obliterated, replaced by the cold, exacting precision of a woman ready for war. Eleanor's internal struggle was not a wobble of doubt, but the last agonizing breath of the docile woman she tried to be. She glanced at Arthur, and for a fleeting, painful millisecond, she saw the man she'd married years ago, not the greedy am and a shark, but the boy with genuine hunger. This ghost of a memory was a sharp trigger. It brought back the smell of wood smoke and old leather from a small cafe near Beacon Hill where he'd proposed. "I don't need your money, Eleanor. I want you," he'd promised. The crushing irony of that lie was now a physical weight on her chest. She took a slow, measured breath, the stale ballroom air heavy with the aroma of deception and expensive cologne. Her instinct, conditioned by years of social training, screamed for retreat, to maintain the veneer and avoid the catastrophic fallout. The crippling fear of social embarrassment was a potent gravitational pull. But then, she heard the echo of his dismissal. "It's tacky, Eleanor. Just like your cheap little necklace." He was judging her heirloom, but he was dismissing her very dignity. The memory of her father, a man of old New England principles, and his grave warnings about Arthur's lack of moral fiber galvanized her. A swift flashback. Her grandmother, placing the pearls around her neck on her 21st birthday. "Never mistake discretion for weakness, darling. Your true worth is what you keep hidden." This familial mantra was the final shield. Retreat was no longer an option. Arthur coughed loudly from the edge of the stage, his impatience mounting. He recognized the shift in her tone, the unexpected depth of her silence. "Honey, perhaps let's stick to the talking points about the Sterling's explosive future," he suggested, his voice tight, his command now unmistakably a tense demand. His microaggression publicly trying to rein her in sealed his fate. He was treating her like a malfunctioning prop. Eleanor slowly brought her hand to her throat, closing her fingers around the necklace. It was more than an heirloom. It was the key to her inheritance and the totem of her real, long-suppressed power. She was there not just for the two-timing, but for the brazen injustice of his financial theft, the way he'd belittled her while secretly depending on her capital. The failure of her most intimate venture, her marriage, was the ultimate catalyst. She spotted the small remote clicker for the projector, carelessly left on the lectern. Arthur had painstakingly scripted this entire evening, but he'd forgotten to account for the actual star of the show. Her hand moved deliberately, grasping the remote. For the first time, she felt Arthur's genuine fear, not the fear of a disappointed wife, but the terror of a man realizing the house always wins. The memory of Arthur reviewing her pitiful bank statement, lecturing her on budgeting while he secretly leveraged her entire family's wealth, crystallized her resolve. She had allowed the $32 charade to persist as a test of His character, he had failed spectacularly. The fleeting shadow of guilt for her own silence instantly gave way to cold, surgical focus. She pressed the button. The silence in the ballroom became a thick, agonizing blanket. Arthur was right, she said, her voice dropping the faint softness and becoming clear, resonant steel. I should get right to the point. The future of the Sterling Group is now. The click of the button was the loudest sound of the evening. All internal resistance dissolved into the resolute calm of a plan finally executed. The stage, now bathed in the uncompromising glare of the spotlight, transformed into her personal inquiry chamber. Eleanor pressed a remote, and the giant LED screen meant to display the Sterling Group's sleek logo flickered. In a moment of lacerating tension, the screen burst into a high-definition close-up. It was the damning evidence. Arthur, locked in an intimate embrace with Vanessa, inside the very luxury condo his company funds had paid for. A collective, strangled gasp filled the room. The carefully cultivated facade of success shattered. Arthur let out a choked sound, a primal mix of fury and disbelief, and lunged towards the stage. He tried to project the air of the shrewd dealer who could always spin a narrative. This is a frame-up, a technical malfunction, he bellowed, his voice cracking, the veneer of the titan melting off his face. He was no longer in control. His social standing, the only thing he truly valued, was disintegrating before the city's old money elite. Eleanor regarded him with the chilling majesty of an aggrieved queen. She kept her focus on the audience, who were now reaching for their phones themselves, becoming live narrative evidence. The white-hot anger over the injustice of his theft, the years of feeling like a negligible zero to a man she had built, gave her an almost supernatural focus. She took a breath, and the pearls on the floor seemed to draw all the light in the room, her silent anchor of truth. This image, ladies and gentlemen, represents an investment, she declared, her sarcasm now sharp enough to draw blood. Arthur's personal investment in his partner, Vanessa. The screen shifted, zooming in on the next slide. A thick, dense document. It was the certified wire transfer record from the Sterling Group's operational account, listing the exact amount used to cover the initial outlay for Vanessa's new place. The cliffhanger was a cold, hard combination of finance and adultery. Arthur tried again to snatch the mic, but Eleanor fluidly stepped out of his reach. I knew he'd try to silence me, she informed the audience, treating her husband like a disruptive, petulant child. He always controls the purse strings, the stage, the narrative. He spent years making me feel like I had no worth, that my meager $32 savings was all I could claim. She allowed a single tear to track a path through her makeup, not of sorrow, but of pure, crystalline outrage. She turned, her gaze burning into Arthur. Do you remember what you said about my necklace, Arthur? You called it cheap, said it was a sign of my poor taste. She touched the empty space on her throat, a gesture heavy with the weight of her unacknowledged sacrifice. She was leading up to the payoff, the reveal of the symbolic object's true significance. The audience hung on every syllable, sensing the impending explosion of a deep, dark secret. She took the ivory envelope from the lectern, the deliberate pace of her actions ratcheting the visual tension. The sound of the paper tearing open was amplified, a dramatic underscore to the silent chaos. The final proof was in her hand. Arthur always credited the seed money for Sterling to his genius, she stated, her voice a whip crack. But the real genius, in fact, was my grandmother, Lillian Vanderbilt. The name, heavy with the weight of old New York money, crashed into the silence. The screen flashed one final time, displaying the last narrative proof, a certified irrevocable trust fund contract, signed by one of the city's most venerable trusts. The document was unmistakable. Eleanor was not only the heir to a vast billion-dollar fortune, but the sole beneficiary who had authorized the exact initial capital Arthur had used to launch the Sterling Group. He had been a kept man by the woman he constantly demeaned. The emotional cliffhanger was utterly ruinous. That money, she explained, her voice low, precise, and calculated, came from a trust I kept off the books. For years, I wanted to see if Arthur loved me for who I was, or who he thought I was. The capital would be released only when I was certain. I was waiting for fidelity. She nodded toward the image of his tryst. I got my answer. Arthur was now practically on top of her, grappling to rip the paper from her hand. His face was a mask of furious, undiluted panic, his grand ambition crumbling beneath his feet. Lies! You have nothing. I own everything, he shrieked. The memory of his financial tyranny fueled her. She had let him play the part to prove his true colors. Eleanor sidestepped him one last time. No, Arthur, you own nothing. She pointed to the document on the screen, highlighting a clear legal clause regarding moral and financial failure. This trust contained a moral turpitude clause, and embezzling funds to pay for your mistress's love nest, duly documented. Arthur, is the textbook definition. She paused, letting the magnitude of the statement sink in. The necklace you called tacky, she concluded, the perfect final note. She slipped the pearls off, holding them up for the light. It's not just pearls. It is the key to my patrimony. And now, her voice rose to a clear, triumphant tone. It is the proof that you have lost your stake. She let the pearls drop to the marble floor of the stage, the scattered sound echoing the finality of her action. Payoff complete. The document confirms that you forfeit the capital I invested, and furthermore, due to your corporate fraud and malfeasance, you now face significant legal repercussions. The murmurs in the ballroom erupted into outright chaos. She looked at Arthur, who was now utterly paralyzed, his face a silent tableau of defeat. She had exposed the ultimate wealth gap, the difference between his inherited ambition and her discreet, genuine dignity. The upstart had tried to rob the quiet heiress and had lost the game. The silence that followed the clatter of the pearls was not empty. It was thick with the humming energy of a profound public reckoning. Arthur tried one last, desperate attempt to reclaim control, a whispered, pathetic plea. You can't do this, Eleanor. We are a unit, he begged, the word unit sounding less like a commitment and more like a final power grab. His play was no longer motivated by love or even self-preservation, but by the sheer, visceral terror of losing everything. Eleanor met his eyes, and her response was a micro-action that spoke volumes. She slowly touched the bare skin of her neck where the necklace had rested, the very spot that had carried the weight of her silent sacrifice and her long-suffering belief in the marriage. Her fingers lingered there, a quiet affirmation of her newly claimed freedom. She was no longer bound to the lie. She took a deliberate step back, establishing a physical boundary that mirrored the unbridgeable emotional chasm between them. The stage lights now seemed to highlight the unflinching dignity in her expression, erasing the last vestiges of the invisible wife. She felt no hot rush of hatred or simple vengeance, but the cold, restorative peace of finally tearing up a contract she should have voided years ago. The high society crowd watched, not as gossips, but as witnesses to a rare, powerful act of vindication. Eleanor's catharsis wasn't a dramatic outburst. It was the quiet, confident shedding of a fraud. Her power wasn't in the wealth she'd revealed, but in the moral fortitude to expose the financial sleight of hand and reclaim her integrity. She had moved irrevocably from internal guilt to decisive, heart-driven action. The event security, alerted to the chaos and the explicit mention of corporate fraud, moved in. They surrounded Arthur with the silent, heavy authority of the law. He bucked and protested, but he was pinned down, utterly humiliated before the very peers whose respect he craved. His public downfall was the exact, calculated price of his breathtaking arrogance, the justice Eleanor had patiently engineered. Eleanor held Arthur's gaze for one final moment. He saw in her eyes not spite, but the deep, unforgiving emptiness of a bond he had systematically destroyed. This was the true turning point. She finally allowed herself to stop resisting her own power and walked away from the wreckage. She turned her back on the man who had demeaned her and stepped down from the platform. She was free. Eleanor never glanced back. She glided through the stunned, murmuring crowd, the sound of her heels a solitary, rhythmic beat against the marble floor, the sound of finality. She had toppled a self-made empire, not with hysterics, but with cold, hard truth. The intense, oppressive glamour of the Manhattan Gala now seemed to illuminate her path to the exit, transforming into a welcome spotlight of liberty. Her smile, once brittle and strained, was now a quiet, profound expression of relief and self-possession. Stepping out onto the cold New York street, the crisp night air felt like a cool balm on her face, a symbolic cleansing from the stale deceit of her old life. A dark, discreet sedan idled at the curb. It wasn't the flashy status symbol Arthur drove, but a vehicle that spoke of old money, discretion, and unostentatious power. She was leaving behind the crushing burden of silent sacrifice and the absolute hollowness of a fraudulent partnership. Before slipping into the back seat, Eleanor paused at the edge of the sidewalk. She looked once at the grand entrance of the hotel, not at the drama unfolding inside, but at the place where she had shed the skin of the invisible wife. With a final, deliberate movement, she took the antique pearl necklace, which she had looped around her wrist, and let it drop. It landed on the icy pavement next to a wrought iron railing, a quiet, definite farewell to the woman she'd tried to be. The sedan pulled smoothly away, and the final shot was of Eleanor in the back seat, her hand resting against the window, watching the glittering city skyline. There was no residue of anger, only a transformation visible in the profound clarity of her gaze. It was the look of a woman who had achieved vindication alone, with surgical precision and immense dignity. The narrator concluded, the voice warm and reflective. He whispered, "I own everything." The truth would break his empire. She was not the piece he played. She was the house, and the house always wins. What would you have done in her place? Waited for the perfect moment or left immediately? Share your thoughts below. If this story moved you, don't forget to like and share it with someone who needs hope and a reminder that justice prevails.